Dr. Sharma administered a fatal dosage at 10:30 a.m. He called it a tragic, inexcusable error. Those were the words of Dr. Pace, the chief of surgery, as he pointed a laser at the main screen. My name is Anya Sharma. This was the hospital's morbidity and mortality review for a Mr. Bind, David Harrison. He died 2 weeks ago during a surgery that was supposed to be routine. Dr. Pace, the chief of surgery, was presenting the case to the board, the administrators, and every senior physician, and he was blaming me. Pace clicked the slide. He turned to face me. He sat in the center of the U-shaped table. A portrait of false concern, a man playing the role of a grieving leader. He had that look on his face, the look he reserves for junior staff and nurses. It was a mixture of pity and contempt. He expected me to fracture. He expected tears, or stammering apologies, or perhaps a desperate, weak defense. He is a god in this hospital. His word is final. And his evidence, the main hospital server log displayed on the screen, looked perfect. I did not speak. I held his gaze. I let the silence in the room stretch until it was uncomfortable for everyone except me. I watched him. I analyzed him. I saw the arrogance. Pace is a brilliant surgeon, but he is lazy. He is intellectually lazy and consumed by his own ego. He believes his position makes him technically proficient. It does not. He thinks my workstation, the anesthesiology tower, is just a peripheral, a dumb machine that follows his orders. He forgot. He forgot that my machine has its own brain. He believed he had altered the timeline. He believed he had successfully edited the hospital record. His fatal mistake was one of ignorance. He only edited one log. My machine saves every vital sign, every single second, to a separate, redundant, tamper-proof server in the IT basement, a server he does not have access to, a server he probably does not even know exists. I remembered the surgery. I remembered the feeling in the room. Pace was rushing. He was annoyed. He had a tea time at 3 p.m. He always schedules his golf for surgical afternoons. He pushed the residents too hard. He snapped at the nurses. I remembered the critical moment. His hand slipped. A clean cut in the wrong place. A sound of controlled panic from the resident. He caused the bleed. Not my medication. He caused it. But gods do not make mistakes. Gods do not bleed. Gods, apparently, just find someone else to blame. I was the convenient choice. The quiet anesthesiologist in the corner. Pace continued his presentation. He spoke in a low, somber voice. He said, "This is what happens when we lose focus." He said he takes responsibility for his department. But the data is absolute. He pointed again to the 10:30 a.m. timestamp. The moment his log claimed the patient's vitals crashed. I remembered my orientation. 4 years ago, Pace himself led the tour. He tapped my anesthesia tower. He called it the gas machine. He told me not to get lost in the numbers. He said, just keep the patient quiet and let the real doctors work. I remember nodding. I remember smiling. And I remember thinking he was a fool. I spent the next year learning the hospital's entire IT infrastructure. I learned exactly where every piece of data went. I learned it because I knew. One day, a god like Pace would eventually try to smite someone. The presentation ended. The room was silent. The hospital chairman, Mr. Davies, looked at me. His face was grave. He told me, Dr. Sharma, that this was a very serious allegation. He asked if I had anything to say in my defense. I saw Pace lean back in his chair. He crossed his arms. He looked satisfied. He looked like a man who had just won. He was waiting for me to cry. He was waiting for me to beg. I looked at the chairman. I looked at the board. Then I looked at Dr. Pace. I let the silence hang again. Just long enough. I would not defend myself. I would simply present the truth. I did not stand. I kept my hands clasped on the table in front of me. I looked past Dr. Pace, directly at Chairman Davies. I told the chairman that a defense was not necessary, but a clarification was. I said Dr. Pace had presented the data from the hospital's central server. I did not dispute that log. I disputed its completeness. Pace shifted in his chair. He uncrossed his arms. A flicker of annoyance. He thought I was questioning a technicality. He said completeness. Dr. Sharma. He said the log is the log. He said it is the single source of truth for every event in that operating room. I looked at him. My voice remained level, clinical. It was the voice I used to read back dosages. I told him that was incorrect. I said there are two sources of truth. The hospital log, which records manual entries and network pings, and the anesthesiology workstation log, which records a non-stop, tamper-proof data stream directly from the patient's vitals. That data is saved to a separate, redundant IT server, not the main hospital server. Pace actually laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of contempt. He looked around the table. He told the chairman this was a desperate stalling tactic. He claimed I was talking about the machine's internal buffer. He said it was irrelevant. He said they had the official record. I told him it was not a buffer. It was the raw data file. I requested that the IT administrator, who I saw was present in this meeting, pull the workstation log for operating room 3 for the date in question. I asked him to please display it side by side with Dr. Pace's log. The chairman looked at Pace, then at me. He was confused, but he was also a man who hated ambiguity. He nodded to the IT administrator. He told him to please do it. Pace stood up. His voice rose. He said this was absurd. He said they were wasting the board's time with a junior doctor's technical fantasy. He said he must object. He said this meeting was to review the facts, not chase distractions. I watched him. He still did not understand. His arrogance, his intellectual laziness, was so profound that he could not see the trap that was closing. He had built his entire case on a lie, believing no one else had a copy of the truth. He was objecting, not because I was wrong, but because he was terrified I might be right. The IT administrator typed for a few moments. He said he had the workstation log. The chairman ordered him to put it on the screen. The main screen split. On the left was Pace's log, the one he had used to condemn me. On the right was my log, the raw data stream. The room was silent. Pace stared at the screen. His face went pale. I did not speak. Pace was shaking his head. He whispered that it was not possible. I continued. I told them to now. Please look at my log. Look at the timestamp 10:47 a.m. That is when the vitals crashed. A sudden, catastrophic bleed. 17 minutes after Dr. Pace claimed the error occurred. I then pointed to Pace's log. The one on the left? The falsified one, I said. And if you look at Dr. Pace's own log, at 10:47 a.m., he has listed himself as performing the primary resection. He was operating. He was in command. And he was the one who made the error. I told the chairman he did not just lie. He falsified a medical record to cover his own fatal mistake. The blood drained from Pace's face. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the two screens. He looked at the faces of the board members. Their expressions were no longer confused. They were horrified. They understood. The god was dead. He had been killed by his own arrogance. And by a single, undeniable data file he was too lazy to know existed. The chairman looked at the IT administrator. He ordered him to secure both of those logs. He ordered him to lock Dr. Pace out of the system. He said this meeting was adjourned. He announced they were initiating a full forensic audit. The board members filed out of the room in silence. They did not look at Pace. They did not look at me. They looked at their phones or at the floor. Dr. Pace remained in his chair, staring at the blank screen where the two logs had been. He was a statue. His career had evaporated in less than 5 minutes. The chairman's final words, "Full forensic audit," echoed in the room. That was the first domino. The reveal of the second log. My log was the push. The audit was the consequence. The board was no longer investigating a medical error. They were investigating a crime. They were terrified. A falsified record. To a patient death. The legal exposure was catastrophic. They needed to know exactly what happened. Exactly when. And exactly who. So they could cauterize the wound. The wound, of course, was Pace. I went back to the anesthesiology department. I drank a cup of black coffee. I felt nothing. No joy. No relief. Just the cold satisfaction of a calculation proven correct. I had built a plan. The plan was not the log itself. The plan was my knowledge that the log existed. It was my understanding of the system. A system Pace held in complete contempt. He always hated the IT department. I remembered a meeting 6 months ago. He had screamed at the chief technology officer because a software update changed the icons on his desktop. He had called the man a help desk clerk. He said he was a surgeon. He did not have time to relearn computers just because some technician wanted to move the buttons. His arrogance was total. He saw the hospital's digital infrastructure as a nuisance. A tool beneath him. He never bothered to learn its rules. That was his second fatal miscalculation. His first was not knowing. My machine had its own brain. His second, the one the audit would now expose, was not knowing. The hospital's brain had a memory. He thought that by changing the log, he was simply correcting the record. He believed that as chief of surgery, his edit became the truth. He was a god, moving his hand to rewrite history. He was too lazy, too arrogant, to understand metadata. He did not know that when he accessed the log, he created a digital footprint. When he altered the entry, he did not erase the old one. He simply wrote a new line of data on top of it. And the system timestamped his action. He thought he was an editor. The system saw him as a vandal. He thought he was covering his tracks. He was, in fact, laying new ones. Like bright red paint on a white floor. The forensic auditors were not doctors. They were technicians. They did not care about his reputation. They did not fear his anger. They were not impressed by his title. They were detectives. And he had just handed them a signed confession. By 4 p.m., the audit was complete. The report was on the chairman's desk. The whispers started instantly. The auditors had found it. They confirmed the hospital log for Mr. Pated. Harrison's surgery was accessed at 5:12 p.m. on the day of the surgery, 2 hours after the patient was pronounced dead. They confirmed the access point was not the operating room terminal. It was the hardwired desktop in Dr. Pace's private office. They confirmed the original data showing stable vitals was overridden with new, falsified data showing a crash at 10:30 a.m. The lie I had exposed in the meeting was now, officially, a federal crime. Falsifying medical records carries a prison sentence. Pace thought he was untouchable. He thought the system was stupid. He did not realize the system, the very help desk he scorned, was the perfect, impartial witness. It recorded his arrogance. It logged his crime, and it would be the thing that buried him. The first domino had fallen. The next, I knew, would be the staff. The nurses, the residents, the people who had lived in fear of him. Terror only works when the tyrant seems invincible. He was not invincible. He was just a fool who did not know how computers worked. The audit report was a nuclear bomb. By the next morning, the hospital was a different place. The silence that followed the M&M meeting was broken. It was replaced by whispers. Vicious, angry, and liberated whispers. The digital report, meant only for the board, had been leaked. Of course it was. A file that explosive cannot be contained. Every nurse, every resident, every technician had heard the news. They knew Pace had been caught. They knew he had been locked out of the system. They knew he falsified the record. I watched it happen from the cafeteria. The entire social structure of the hospital was realigning itself in real time. Pace ruled by terror. He was a screamer. He was a man who would humiliate a surgical resident in front of his entire team for asking a simple question. He would throw instruments if a nurse handed him the wrong one. He was a hot aggressor. A classic bully who used narcissistic rage as a tool of management. He believed it kept people sharp. It did not. It kept them silent. But terror only works when the tyrant seems invincible. When I showed them the second log, I did not just expose a lie. I exposed him. A god does not bleed. But Pace bled data. And now, the sharks had arrived. The first was Nurse Ramirez. She was the head scrub nurse for cardiac surgery. A woman with 30 years of experience. I had seen Pace scream at her. In the operating room. Until she cried. He told her she was a glorified waitress who should just be quiet when she tried to warn him he was using the wrong suture size. That was 6 months ago. At an A.M., Nurse Ramirez filed a formal complaint with the hospital board. It was not about Mr. Harrison. It was about a different patient, a Mrs. Petrov, who had died of a post-surgical infection. Ramirez's complaint stated that she had told Pace the sterile field was compromised. He ignored her. He proceeded with the surgery. The patient died 3 days later. Ramirez stated she was too intimidated to file the report at the time. She was not intimidated anymore. By noon, 2 surgical residents had filed their own reports. They detailed instances of Pace leaving non-critical portions of surgery to them, unsupervised. While he left the hospital to take personal calls, he would then sign the chart as if he had been present the entire time. That was insurance fraud. I sat in my office, reviewing my own schedules. I did not participate. I did not have to. My work was done. My one cold clinical action in that meeting had been the removal of the keystone. Now, the entire arch of Pace's tyranny was collapsing under its own weight. I thought about his arrogance. He believed the fear he inspired was a sign of respect. He mistook silence for agreement. He never once considered that the people he terrified were also the people who watched him, the people who remembered. They were the ones who knew where all the bodies were buried. And now, they had been given permission to start digging. The board, I realized, was now in a new kind of hell. They thought they were handling a single isolated incident. They thought they could cut Pace loose, blame him, and move on. They thought they were containing the damage, but the damage was not a leak. It was a flood. The staff revolt. This second domino was not about Mr. Harrison. It was about everything. It was about a decade of malpractice, abuse, and systemic negligence that had been protected by one man's manufactured terror. By the end of the day, the chairman's office had received 17 new, formal complaints against Dr. Pace. 17. The legal department, which had been calmly preparing to fire one doctor, was now facing a class action lawsuit from its own staff. The problem was no longer Dr. Pace. The problem was the hospital. This, I knew, would trigger the next domino. The hospital's lawyers would have to make a choice, and they would choose self-preservation. Arthur Vance was the hospital's general counsel. He was not a doctor. He was a lawyer. A man who specialized in one thing: institutional risk. His entire job, his entire worldview, was based on a simple calculation: how to make a problem go away. The forensic audit report was a problem. The 17 new complaints, the ones that flooded in from the nurses and residents, that was not 17 problems. To Arthur Vance, that was a pattern. That was a systemic failure. And that failure had a name: Dr. Robert Pace. I saw Vance in the main atrium. He was walking with Chairman Davies. They were not talking. They were just walking. 2 men in expensive suits, looking like they had aged a decade since yesterday. They looked grim. They looked like men who had not slept. They looked like men who had been forced to accept a catastrophic loss. I knew what was happening. This was the third domino. The staff revolt. The consequence of the audit had changed the entire equation. The board was no longer dealing with one doctor's single, panicked lie about one patient. The 17 complaints proved a pattern of behavior, a chronic, systemic, multi-year history of abuse, negligence, and, in the case of the resident signing off on his charts, outright fraud. This was the moment the hospital's immune system, illegal department, finally identified Pace as a virus. He was no longer the chief of surgery. He was no longer the hospital's rainmaker. The genius who brought in millions in research grants and high-profile patients, he was now a liability. He was a bomb that had already gone off. And the legal department was just now seeing how far the shrapnel had flown. I have always understood the hospital, not as a place of healing, but as an entity. It is not a moral being. It is a corporation. It seeks only to survive. For 10 years, the hospital had survived and thrived by protecting Pace. His arrogance was tolerated because his revenue was high. His narcissistic rage was dismissed as the eccentricity of a genius. The system was designed to protect him. The nurses who complained, the residents who burned out, they were seen as disruptions. They were the problem, not Pace. But when I revealed the second log in that meeting, I had given the hospital new data. I had proven that Pace was not just an asset, he was a risk. The forensic audit, the first domino, confirmed that risk was criminal. The staff revolt. The second domino, confirmed that risk was systemic. Now, the hospital's survival instinct had flipped. To protect itself, it could no longer protect Pace. It had to destroy him. Arthur Vance, I knew, would not be thinking about justice for Mr. Bruzant. Harrison, he would not be thinking about the 30 years Nurse Ramirez had endured. He would be thinking about the hospital's bond rating. He would be thinking about the catastrophic legal exposure from 17 new, documented cases of malpractice. He would be thinking about the press. And he would arrive at a single, cold, logical conclusion. The only way for the hospital to survive the scandal was to be the hero of the story. It could not be the institution that covered up a decade of Pace's crimes. It had to be the institution that bravely exposed him. At 3 p.m., 2 men in dark suits, men who were clearly not doctors, arrived at the hospital. They did not go to the chairman's office. They went to the legal department. They were from the district attorney's office. Arthur Vance had made his move. He had self-reported. He had handed the district attorney a perfectly packaged case, the forensic audit, my original data, the conflicting logs, and the 17 new complaints. He was feeding Pace to the wolves to save the hospital. Pace thought he was the system. He thought the hospital was his shield. He never understood that to the system. He was just a tool, and when a tool breaks, or becomes too dangerous to hold, the system simply drops it, or, in this case, hands it over to the police. This was no longer a hospital review. It was a criminal investigation. That was the third domino. The district attorney's office does not operate in secret. When investigators arrived at a major hospital and seized the records of its chief of surgery, the story was inevitable. It broke on the local news at 6 p.m. I was at home, making tea. I watched the report on my small kitchen television. A local reporter was standing in front of the hospital's main entrance. The anchor was using words like shocking, criminal, and falsified records. They did not use my name. They did not need to. They used Dr. Pace's name. They used it repeatedly. This was the fourth domino. The public. The hospital's legal counsel, Arthur Vance, had tried to control the narrative by self-reporting. He had hoped, I am sure, to keep it a quiet, managed plea deal. But the staff revolt, the 17 complaints, made it too big. It was no longer a quiet resignation. It was a scandal. And scandals, like blood in water, Attract the press. I thought about Dr. Pace. I wondered what he was doing. At that exact moment, was he watching the same report? Did he finally understand? I doubted it. Arrogance like his is a form of blindness. He was probably still blaming me. He was probably telling himself this was all a misunderstanding that he could fix once he spoke to the board. He still believed the system he had exploited would, in the end, still value him. But the press changes everything. The board members, the administrators, they no longer had to answer only to their lawyers. They now had to answer to the public. Their precious reputation, the brand of the hospital, was now linked to a criminal. And then I thought about the Harrison family. Mr. David Harrison, the patient, the man who had died. I wondered what Pace had told them. I knew his methods. He was a master of the cold actor routine. He would have met the family in the small .cov gray consultation room. He would have held their hands. He would have looked devastated. He would have told them, with profound sadness, that everything was done but that a tragic, unavoidable complication had occurred. Or perhaps he used me then, just as he tried to use me in the meeting. Perhaps he told them my error was the cause. He would have framed it as a tragedy for everyone involved, including the young doctor who had made a mistake. He would have used the lie to comfort them, to give them a simple, easy to understand reason for their loss. He would have performed his role as the grieving, in-control chief, and they would have believed him. They would have believed the God. Now, tonight, the Harrison family was also watching the 6 o'clock news. They were seeing their loved one's name in a new context. They were hearing the words falsified records and criminal investigation. They were learning, for the first time, that the story they were told in that gray room was not a tragedy. It was a lie. Pace's fatal miscalculation was, again, his arrogance. He believed his lie to the family was a one-time event. He believed it was finished. Buried with Mr. Harrison, he never imagined that the data, my data, would resurrect the truth. The family's grief would now be turning into something else. It would be turning into rage. The tragedy they had started to process was now revealed as a betrayal. They were not just victims of malpractice. They were victims of fraud. I knew what would happen next. I did not need to be a lawyer like Arthur Vance to see this. The district attorney was investigating the crime, but the family would investigate the money. This was the next domino. The civil suit, the lawsuit that would seek to strip Pace, and the hospital that protected him. Of everything, Pace had not just killed a man with his arrogance, he had lied about it. And that lie, the one he told to the family to protect his ego, was about to cost him, and the hospital, hundreds of millions of dollars. The public revelation had triggered the avalanche. The district attorney moved slowly. The wheels of the law grind with methodical, bureaucratic precision. The civil lawsuits, the ones the Harrison family was now certainly filing, would take years to navigate depositions and motions. Both of those dominoes, the criminal and the financial, were built for a war of attrition. But the fifth domino was different. It was fast. It was brutal. And it was absolute. The State Board of Medical Examiners. They are not police officers. And they are not trial lawyers. They are doctors. They are the high priests of the profession. They do not care about reasonable doubt, and they do not care about financial settlements. Their only mandate, their only purpose, is to protect the public from dangerous physicians. And their greatest fear is a public scandal that erodes the trust in their entire profession. When the district attorney's office, the third domino, launched its formal investigation, it automatically notified the state board. That is protocol. But when the news hit the press, the fourth domino, a quiet notification turned into a 5-alarm fire. The board could not be perceived as waiting or studying the problem. They had to act. Pace, I am sure, was hiring criminal defense attorneys. He was preparing for a trial. He was still, in his own mind. A god, brought low by a temporary inconvenience. He believed he could fight this. He believed he could argue semantics. He never understood. The medical board does not go to trial. It holds a hearing. It does not need a jury. It only needs to establish that a physician's conduct demonstrates a lack of fitness to practice. The evidence submitted to them was the same evidence that started it all. The 2 server logs, the conflicting timelines, my clarification in the M&M meeting. The chairman looked at Pace, then at me. He was confused, but he was also a man who hated ambiguity. He nodded to the IT administrator. He told him to please do it. A junior resident making an error is a tragedy. A chief of surgery falsifying a medical record to cover an error. That is not a mistake. That is heresy. It is the single greatest sin a doctor can commit. It is a violation of the oath. It is a betrayal of the entire profession. The board held an emergency hearing. I was not asked to attend. I did not need to. The logs spoke for themselves. They were objective. They were absolute. The 5th domino fell 3 days after the story broke. The board issued its ruling. A summary suspension. Effective immediately. They revoked Dr. Robert Pace's license to practice medicine. His criminal trial was months away. His civil trial was years away. But his career was over. It ended on a Tuesday, with a single-page PDF uploaded to the medical board's public website. He was no longer Dr. Pace. He was just Pace. He was no longer a god. He was no longer even a doctor. He was a man in an expensive suit, now facing criminal charges, who was no longer legally allowed to write a prescription for aspirin. I had not spoken a word to him since the M&M meeting. I had not filed a complaint. I had not talked to the press. I did not have to. I had done only one thing. I had shown them the truth. And the truth, once it was free, was doing all the work for me. The god of the operating room had been excommunicated from his own church. A junior resident making an error is a tragedy. A chief of surgery falsifying a medical record to cover an error. That is not a mistake. That is heresy. It is the single greatest sin a doctor can commit. It is a violation of the oath. It is a betrayal of the entire profession. Dr. Pace was not just a surgeon. He was an icon. A brand. A dynasty within the hospital. He had been mentored by Dr. Elias Thorne, the man who practically invented modern cardiac surgery at this institution. Pace was Thorne's protégé, his golden boy, his hand-picked successor. He was no longer Dr. Pace. He was just Pace. He was no longer a god. He was no longer even a doctor. He was a man in an expensive suit, now facing criminal charges, who was no longer legally allowed to write a prescription for aspirin. His greatest source of pride was the new surgical wing, the Dr. Robert Pace Center for Surgical Innovation. His name was carved in 3-foot-high brushed steel letters above the main entrance. It was his monument to himself. He had spent 5 years fundraising for it, using his name, his reputation, and his legacy as the leverage. He believed that legacy made him untouchable. He thought that even if he was in trouble, the old guard, men like Elias Thorne, who was still on the board, would protect him. He was family. They would circle the wagons. This was his final, most profound miscalculation. The aristocracy does not protect its failures. It exiles them. It does so more brutally than anyone else. Because a failure in their ranks is not just an error, it is an embarrassment. It stains the entire class. The board held an emergency session. The revocation of his license by the state board, the 5th domino, had made their position untenable. They were no longer just dealing with a legal problem. They were dealing with a public relations catastrophe. The 5th domino fell 3 days after the story broke. The board issued its ruling, a summary suspension, effective immediately. They revoked Dr. Robert Pace's license to practice medicine. Elias Thorne himself, Pace's mentor, was the one who spoke. He was 90 years old, frail, but his voice was like iron. He did not defend Pace. He did not ask for leniency. He spoke of the sanctity of the hospital. He spoke of public trust. He spoke of an egregious betrayal that had tarnished the legacy of the institution. He never used Pace's name. He only referred to him as the physician in question. Then, he made the motion. He proposed an immediate vote to rename the Dr. Robert Pace Center for Surgical Innovation. He said the name would be changed back to the North Tower. Effective immediately. The vote was unanimous. I watched Pace's mentor, the man who was like a father to him, erase him from the very walls of the hospital. It was not done out of anger. It was done out of cold, brutal necessity. It was brand management. Pace's name was now poison, and they were purging it. This, I thought, was true destruction. The criminal trial would take away his freedom. The lawsuits would take away his money. The medical board had taken away his career. But this took away his name. It took away his legacy. It retroactively deleted him from the hospital's history. He was no longer a pillar. He was a stain that needed to be sandblasted off the wall. Pace thought his connections were his final shield. He never realized that to the institution, he was just another nameplate. And nameplates can be unscrewed. This was the social execution, the complete and total excommunication from the club he had dedicated his life to. This, I knew, was the one blow his ego could never, ever survive. A man like Pace, a true narcissist, can survive almost anything. He could survive the criminal charges. He would call it a witch hunt. He could survive the lawsuits. That was just the cost of doing business. He could even, I think, have survived the loss of his license. He would have simply become a consultant, charging outrageous fees to tell other doctors what to do. He could survive any attack on his money or his freedom. But he could not survive the attack on his identity. The seventh domino was his psychological collapse. And it was the direct, inevitable, logical consequence of the sixth, when the board, led by his own mentor, Elias Thorne, voted to strip his name from the surgical wing. They did not just fire him. They did not just sue him. They erased him. A narcissist's entire reality is built on the reflections they see in the eyes of others. Pace's God complex was not self-sustaining. It required constant fuel. It required the fear of the residents, the admiration of the board, the public validation of his name carved in steel. He needed the world to tell him he was a god, so he could believe it himself. I had taken that away. My testimony, the cold, simple presentation of the 2 server logs, had started it all. The audit confirmed the lie. The staff revolt confirmed the pattern. The DA confirmed the crime. The lawsuits confirmed the cost. The medical board confirmed the career death. But it was Thorne, his mentor, who confirmed the legacy death. By voting to rename the wing, Thorne held up a mirror to Pace. And for the first time in his life, the mirror was empty. It reflected nothing. The news of the renaming was the final blow. It was the one narcissistic injury from which he could not recover. I heard about it from a surgical resident, Maria. She called me late that night. She sounded strange, not happy, just quiet. She told me I needed to know. She said he had come to the hospital. I asked what she meant. She said, Pace, Dr. Pace. He came to the surgical wing. He tried to use his key card on the secure entrance. Of course, it was deactivated. He just stood there, swiping it, over and over. He was wearing his suit, but he looked small. Maria told me she and another nurse watched him from the internal window. He was not yelling. He was not raging. Not like he used to. He just looked confused. He looked like a man who had forgotten his own address. He was swiping the card, again and again, at the door to the building that, until that morning, had been him. Finally, he stopped swiping. He just put his hand on the glass. He looked up. At the space above the door where the crane had already removed the 3-foot-high steel letters of his name, there was just a blank, clean granite wall, with the faint outline of where his legacy used to be. He just stared at it. For 5 full minutes, he just stood there, in the dark, staring at the blank wall. Then, security came. They did not put hands on him. They just spoke to him, and he turned around, got back in his car, and drove away. That was the collapse. It was not a dramatic courtroom explosion. It was not a public screaming match. It was the quiet, pathetic, final implosion of a man who had built his entire world on a lie. He had lost his name. He had lost his mentor. And in that moment, staring at the blank wall, he had lost his mind. He had been so arrogant, so certain of his place in the world, that he never once considered he could be wrong. He had been so lazy, so contemptuous of the help desk and the gas machine, that he never realized the system he despised was the one thing that was telling the truth. He was a god who had been deleted, and he had, in the end, been deleted by his own hand, by his own ignorance. The 7th domino had not just fallen, it had shattered. It has been 1 month. The hospital has a new, quiet, efficient terror. It is not the sound of a surgeon screaming, it is the sound of keyboards clicking. As auditors from 3 different agencies now live in our conference rooms, Dr. Pace is gone. That is the simplest way to say it. He is not just fired. He is a non-person. He has been indicted by the district attorney on 22 counts, ranging from falsifying records to reckless endangerment and insurance fraud. The Harrison family's lawsuit, the one I knew was coming, is seeking $200 million. The other 17 complaints are being settled, one by one, for catastrophic sums. The hospital is bleeding money and reputation. I was called to the boardroom again. The same U-shaped table, the same gray carpet, the same grim-faced administrators. But this time, I was not sitting at the end. The defendant. I was sitting at the center, in the chair once occupied by Elias Thorne. Chairman Davies looked exhausted. He looked at me, and there was a new expression on his face. It was not pity or contempt. It was respect. A fearful, disparity, respect. He told me, Dr. Sharma, that the board had spent the last 30 days analyzing the systemic failures that led to the Pace incident. I let the phrase hang in the air. The Pace incident, a delicate, corporate word for a decade of tyranny and criminal negligence. He always hated the IT department. I remembered a meeting 6 months ago. He had screamed at the chief technology officer because a software update changed the icons on his desktop. He had called the man a help desk clerk. He said he was a surgeon. He did not have time to relearn computers just because some technician wanted to move the buttons. His arrogance was total. He saw the hospital's digital infrastructure as a nuisance, a tool beneath him. He never bothered to learn its rules. I remained silent. I just watched him. I thought about the first meeting. In this same room, I thought about Pace, and his laser pointer, and his look of utter, arrogant contempt. The chairman said the board had voted. They were forming a new hospital-wide data integrity task force. It would have full authority to review and rebuild all of our record-keeping systems, from the surgical suites to the pharmacy. They wanted me to lead it. I did not smile. I did not act surprised. This was not a reward. It was a logical, necessary conclusion. When their god failed, they had turned to the one person who had proven she could read the data. They were not offering me a promotion. They were offering me a cleanup job. They were asking me to save them from themselves. I thought about Pace's old office. The one on the top floor. The one with the view. The one whose name had been sandblasted off the wall. They had offered it to me. I had declined. I kept my small, windowless office in the anesthesiology wing. I looked at the chairman. I said I would lead the task force. On one condition. He tensed. He was not used to conditions. He said they would do anything. I said my first act would be to make a new hospital-wide policy, effective immediately. Any and all morbidity and mortality reviews will require a dual log verification. The workstation log and the hospital log will be presented side by side. Always. All data streams will be considered equal. All of them will be treated as the source of truth. The very plan I had built for myself was now going to be the standard for everyone. The chairman nodded. I looked relieved. He said, of course. He said that was exactly right. I left the meeting. I walked back to my office. I sat in my chair. I looked at the 2 monitors on my desk. One was connected to the main hospital network. The other was hardwired directly to my workstation server. My data. My truth. Pace was a god who thought he was the system. He thought his will could change reality. He was wrong. He never understood. The system, the cold, logical, digital, unblinking system always wins. The truth is not made by the man with the loudest voice. The truth is in the metadata. It is in the log files. It is in the numbers. And the numbers do not lie.